After losing her parents, the girl is taken in by her uncle, but life under someone else's roof proves to be incredibly difficult. Not only does her aunt treat her as a thorn in her side, even her 3 cousins often beat and scold her. Whenever the children make any noise, her aunt locks her in a dark room without asking any questions. Faced with such fear, no one pays attention to her helpless cries. The girl's name is Jane. Despite living in such a harsh environment, having a place to stay, food to eat, and books to read each day allows her to briefly forget her troubles. But misfortune eventually arrives. Less than a month after her uncle passes away, her aunt contacts an orphanage. In front of the headmaster, Jane's aunt constantly complains about her. She says Jane is strange, unruly, ill-mannered, and disobedient, which is why she wants to send her away. On the staircase, Jane is pushed and shoved downstairs by her cousins, yet she never fights back. However, a trace of stubbornness remains on her face. Jane understands that her aunt has abandoned her. She obediently follows the headmaster, preparing to leave. Before stepping out the door, Jane gathers her courage and speaks to her aunt.
For if I were, I should say that I love you. I dislike you worst of anybody in the world, except your son.
Your bags, Jane Eyre.
As her aunt is caught off guard by Jane's sudden defiance, the headmaster assures her that even the wildest horse can be tamed into a meek lamb once it enters their orphanage. In this way, Jane completely becomes an orphan, even though her father once exchanged a large inheritance for her upbringing by her uncle and aunt. It ultimately fails to awaken any kindness in her aunt. The moment Jane steps into the orphanage, the headmaster decides to give her a harsh lesson. He makes Jane stand on a stool and orders the other children to isolate her. Listening to the headmaster repeat the same slander her aunt used, Jane's heart grows ice cold. She has moved from one abyss into an even darker one. Jane is forced to stand on that small stool for an entire afternoon, and she is not even given dinner. In the cold dormitory at night, the sound of children coughing echoes beneath their thin blankets. After the supervising nun leaves, a girl named Helen takes a small piece of bread from under her pillow and gives it to Jane. It turns out Helen saved it from dinner specifically for her. In this bleak world, Helen's kindness brings warmth to Jane. The next morning, the children can only wash with water covered in ice, and the cold makes it unbearable to even touch. Early in the day, the headmaster's assistant begins scolding the girls. Helen, who has been sick for a long time, coughs a few times and is immediately criticized. She only offers a brief explanation, but is met with a harsh beating.
Nothing will cure you of your slovenly habits.
Sorry, Miss Scatchard.
When Jane tries to draw a portrait of Helen as a gesture of gratitude, the headmaster walks in and witnesses the scene. He questions Helen for letting her hair down, claiming it is improper and ill-mannered. The teacher Reed attempts to defend Helen, but the headmaster continues to insult her relentlessly. Jane bravely steps forward and offers to share the punishment with Helen. That night, Reed comforts Jane and Helen, saying that short hair can also be beautiful. At this moment, Helen's cough appears even more severe. After helping Helen lie down, Reed tells the girls warm and comforting stories. Her gentle voice drives away the cold surrounding them. Just as they are immersed in the story, the arrival of Scatchard interrupts this rare moment of peace. Reed feels helpless and suggests to the assistant that Helen needs medical attention, but the assistant replies that there is no precedent for doctors here, and whether the children survive depends on their fate. In the middle of the night, Jane notices that Helen's bed is empty. She quietly searches in the dark and finally finds her in a damp basement. It turns out the headmaster secretly moved Helen there after her condition worsened, leaving her to fend for herself. Helen now burns with a high fever, her face flushed red. She gently scolds Jane for not wearing shoes on the freezing floor and invites her onto the bed. Seeing how weak Helen is, Jane cannot hold back her tears. That night, Helen rests against Jane, falls asleep, and never wakes again. In the days that follow, Jane secretly goes to the backyard every day, standing before Helen's grave and telling her everything that happened that day. In the blink of an eye, 10 years pass, and even as an adult, Jane keeps this habit. On this day, after visiting Helen one last time, she brings her 10 years in the orphanage to an end. According to the rules, once they reach adulthood, they can choose to marry or step into society to find their own path. Reed is the only light in the orphanage, doing everything she can to help every girl there. She secures a position for Jane as a governess. Jane treasures this opportunity deeply. After an emotional farewell, Jane boards a carriage heading north. Along the journey, even the air feels free. and she is filled with confidence about the future. From morning until afternoon, the carriage finally stops in front of a mysterious castle. A servant named John warmly welcomes her inside, but once she enters, the interior of the estate reveals a whole new world, grand and magnificent, reflecting the extraordinary status of its owner. The housekeeper also appears kind and gentle. After offering Jane a cup of warm tea, she begins to talk about the master of the house. She explains that the master rarely stays at the estate, and whenever he returns, he never gives notice, only staying for a day or two before leaving again. With a rather eccentric personality, at that moment, the master's daughter walks in. Jane's job is to educate this young girl. The girl immediately takes a liking to Jane, clearly pleased with the governess her father has arranged. The housekeeper says that although the master is strict, he dotes deeply on his daughter. Jane, with her broad knowledge, was carefully chosen as the governess. As the housekeeper leads Jane to her bedroom, a strange and eerie wailing sound seems to come from the far end of the third-floor corridor. Jane does not dwell on it. The bedroom prepared for her is clean and bright, and life here feels like the opening of a new world, leaving Jane deeply satisfied. The next day, the housekeeper shows Jane around the estate. Every detail reflects the master's unique taste, which makes Jane increasingly curious about him. Thus, Jane begins her work at the estate. The little girl, long deprived of parental affection, grows very attached to Jane, and they get along harmoniously. A month later, Jane decides to visit a nearby town to send a letter to Reed and let her know she is safe. On her way to town, she encounters a man riding a horse. The man turns to look at her and loses control of the horse, falling to the ground. Jane immediately steps forward to ask if he needs help. Although his ankle is badly swollen, he endures the pain and begins to talk with Jane. During their conversation, the man learns that Jane is the governess he has hired, but he does not reveal his identity. He gestures for Jane to bring his horse over, but the horse refuses to obey. With no other choice, Jane helps support the man as they approach the horse together. This is Jane's first encounter with her master. The man's name is Rochester. When Jane returns to the estate after sending the letter, it is already night. Rochester has been waiting for her in the study. Only then does Jane realize that the man she met earlier is her employer. When they meet again, neither of them shows any surprise. The little girl immediately runs to Jane's side and clings to her. When Rochester asks about Jane's background and learns she is an orphan, he shows a trace of sympathy, yet still maintains a proud demeanor, even blaming her for his earlier fall. In the following days, everything seems calm. Jane excels in music, chess, painting, and literature, and Rochester is very satisfied with her teaching, since her father is often away. The little girl asks Jane to paint a portrait of him so she can see him every day even when he is gone. Jane agrees and quickly sketches Rochester's likeness when he is not paying attention. But they do not escape Rochester's notice. He has seen all kinds of women. Jane's quiet purity and simple grace feel like a fresh breeze, giving him a renewed sense of the beauty of life. He pretends to scold her for making him look unattractive and tears the drawing apart. As Jane tries to explain, Rochester leaves behind only one sentence. He says that everyone sees him as a strange man, yet no one truly understands his strangeness. With an inexplicable displeasure, he leaves the estate. A few days later, Rochester returns with a complicated expression. As he enters, he sees Jane rehearsing a dance with his daughter, a scene filled with warmth. This long-lost feeling of warmth causes Rochester to fall into deep thought. Late at night, the autumn wind knocks against Jane's window while everyone else is asleep. Jane is awakened by a chill. As she gets up to close the window, she faintly hears a noise outside her door. Fortunately, Jane discovers the fire in time and prevents a disaster. Rochester expresses his gratitude to Jane and even places his coat over her shoulders. As for the fire, He seems unsurprised. He tells Jane that the fire may have been caused by the negligence of a strange and eccentric servant in the house. Furious, he storms to the innermost room on the 3rd floor, only returning to the study at dawn, frightened by the incident. Jane falls asleep on the sofa. Rochester notices that Jane's hand was injured while saving him the previous night. At that moment, his heart, once as hard as stone, suddenly softens. At such close distance, a subtle excitement grows between them, an indescribable feeling quietly taking root during that night. The next morning, Jane discovers that the servant Rochester blamed has not been dismissed. The servant mutters that this is not the first fire, and that one day, their master will be burned to death. Jane curiously asks whether the fire was intentional, but the servant hesitates and refuses to answer. Jane tries to get answers from the housekeeper, but before she can finish speaking, the housekeeper drops the sheet in her hands in panic. She brushes it off, telling Jane not to listen to baseless rumors. Yet Jane senses that the estate hides a secret unknown to others. The servants remain busy all day, even preparing the rarely used banquet hall. The housekeeper tells Jane that although the master usually dislikes crowds, he is hosting a party tonight. By afternoon, guests begin arriving one after another. The most famous socialite in the region, Temple, steps down from her carriage with Rochester's assistance. Jane suddenly feels inferior, thinking that only such a dazzling woman could match a man of Rochester's status. They seem perfectly suited for each other. Jane and the girl hide in the attic, quietly observing everything happening in the garden. The girl remarks that she has never seen her father like this before. That evening, the housekeeper knocks on Jane's door. Rochester wishes to invite her downstairs to meet his friends, but surrounded by elegantly dressed ladies with exquisite makeup, Jane feels completely out of place and deeply uncomfortable. Rochester's gaze repeatedly drifts toward Jane. Temple whispers mockingly in Rochester's ear, ridiculing him for hiring a country girl as a governess. Not only does Rochester fail to defend Jane, he even dances intimately with Temple. Jane suddenly feels like an unnecessary presence and turns to leave, but Rochester abandons Temple and quickly follows her. With a sarcastic tone, he questions Jane. Later,
Jane, you look pale. Is my dancing so clumsy?
No, sir.
Come back to the drawing room. It's too early to go to bed.
I'm tired, sir.
And a little depressed. What about? Tell me.
Nothing, sir. I'm not depressed.
Did I see them there? No.
Please excuse me, sir. I'm very tired.
Very well. I'll excuse you tonight, but so long as my visitors stay, I would like you to appear in the drawing room every evening.
as Jane helps the girl fall asleep, Rochester appears to be searching for her anxiously. He brings her to a guest room on the 2nd floor, where a severely injured man is hidden. The man's back looks as if it has been torn apart by a wild beast, bleeding profusely. With her basic medical knowledge, Jane performs simple first aid. By midnight, Rochester returns with a doctor. After treatment, they secretly send the man away overnight. The injured man turns out to be Rochester's friend from London, whose identity must remain concealed. Despite having many friends, Jane is the only person Rochester truly trusts in this house. The gathering at the estate continues. Jane receives a letter from her aunt. In the letter, her aunt says she is gravely ill and wishes to see Jane one last time. Although she suffered greatly in her childhood, Jane has let go of the past and decides to say goodbye. Faced with Jane's sudden leave request, Rochester becomes unsettled. He worries that Jane might not return. He also wonders whether his closeness with Temple has hurt her. At this moment, he still cannot fully understand Jane's heart, so Rochester makes Jane promise that she will return immediately once everything is settled. Jane returns to her uncle's house after more than 10 years. Nothing has changed, except that it now feels more desolate. Her once wasteful cousin is no longer alive. Her frail aunt lies in bed, and upon seeing the travel-worn Jane, guilt appears in her eyes. After sincerely apologizing for her past actions, she asks Jane to retrieve a letter from a drawer. It turns out that Jane has an uncle living in Edinburgh. Because of a long-standing conflict with Jane's father, they had lost contact. This wealthy uncle, who never married, had written years earlier, leaving all his property to Jane. In a twist of fate, Jane, who endured so much suffering, unexpectedly inherits a great fortune. Meanwhile, Rochester and his daughter grow increasingly fond of Jane by looking at her drawings. On the hill behind the estate, a man and his dog appear every day, gazing into the distance. A month later, Jane returns with her newfound fortune. Although Rochester feels joy, he suppresses it. In just 1 month, he appears much more worn and exhausted. After dinner, Rochester invites Jane for a walk. He tells her that he is about to be married. His daughter will also leave for school in Edinburgh. Hearing this, Jane feels an inexplicable sadness. At that moment, she realizes that this man has long been the one stirring her heart. But now, she believes she is no longer needed here. Rochester continues, saying he has arranged a better paying position for her in Edinburgh. He hopes she will live a better life there. At this point, Jane can no longer suppress her emotions and releases everything she has held inside.
I wish I'd never come to Thornfield.
Your other house is just as fine.
How can you be so stupid? How can you be so cruel? I may be poor and plain, but I'm not without feelings. It's not the house, but the life I lived here. I was not trampled on. I was not excluded. I was treated as an equal.
So you are, Jane.
What Jane does not know is that Rochester, proud and reserved, has no real engagement. He uses this to test her true feelings. Once he gets the answer he seeks, they finally stop hiding, and their passionate hearts come together. They decide to hold a simple wedding. Rochester carefully chooses a wedding dress for her. On the staircase of the estate, he places a ring on her finger as a symbol of loyalty. Everything seems so perfect. Filled with hope, Jane looks forward to the beginning of a new life. In a small church attended only by the housekeeper and a servant, the priest begins the ceremony. But halfway through, two unknown men suddenly burst into the church.
Mr. Rochester is a married man.
Who are you?
My name is Briggs. I'm a lawyer. I was engaged to look after the interests of your wife.
There is no wife.
I affirm and can prove that on the 20th day of October, 1829, Edward Fairfax Rochester of Thornfield Hall was married to my sister, Bertha Antoinetta. A copy of the wedding certificate is now in my possession. Signed, Richard Mason.
It is revealed that more than a decade ago, their fathers arranged a marriage for family interests, binding two people who did not love each other. On the day of the wedding, Rochester discovered that his bride was mentally unstable. The 8-year-old daughter is in fact his adopted child. When Rochester brings everyone to see his wife, the secret of the estate is finally exposed. This is also the root of his eccentric personality. After more than 10 years of repression, he rarely returned here. It was only after meeting Jane that Rochester decided to be brave. But Jane's presence also awakens the primal hatred of a disturbed woman. At this moment, all the strange events that happened in the estate finally have their explanation. When Rochester's wife rushes toward her with a burning torch, Jane realizes it is time to leave.
I love you. Say you love me.
I love you more than ever. But this is the last time I shall ever say it.
Watching Jane go, Rochester knows they may never see each other again. He tries to hold on to her.
Jane! Don't leave me, Jane! Jane!
From the attic window, his wife witnesses the scene. Taking advantage of the servant's distraction, she grabs a torch, goes to Jane's room, and sets the wedding dress on the bed ablaze.
Mr. Rochester! The house, sir!
Trust me, Bertha, trust me! Leah! John!
Come close to me, don't be afraid. I would never harm you. No. Bertha, come to me.
After returning to her aunt's estate, Jane falls seriously ill. During this time, the lawyer Rivers, who is helping her handle the inheritance, takes great care of her. When Rivers hands Jane photographs of her uncle and father, he also gives her a legal document. This means Jane no longer needs to rely on others for work, and she becomes a truly wealthy woman. Jane returns to the orphanage to visit the two people who once brought warmth into her childhood, Reed and Helen. Yet at every moment, one person's voice lingers in her ears. Money cannot bring Jane happiness. and Rochester's figure constantly appears in her mind. When Rivers confesses his love to Jane, she realizes that love has nothing to do with wealth. Although the man before her is young, wealthy, and handsome, her heart still cannot let go of Rochester, so she makes a decision. A few days later, a carriage stops in front of Rochester's estate. Jane is stunned by the sight before her. The once grand and magnificent manor has turned into ruins, filled with desolation and decay. The housekeeper is astonished by Jane's arrival. The moment Jane hears Rochester's voice, she ignores the housekeeper's calls behind her and walks in without hesitation. Rochester's wife perished in that great fire, and he lost his sight while trying to save her. Within Jane's delicate frame lies a character far stronger than many women of her time. Even in hardship, she remains resilient, though she loved deeply. When Rochester once hoped she would pull him out of despair, staying would have meant crossing moral boundaries. She chose not to betray her principles and left instead, holding firmly to her sense of self and dignity. Jane returns to Rochester when he has lost everything.